So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run around after all those things. But your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Amen. That classic Jimmy Stewart. How many? I've asked the question. How many have seen It's a Wonderful Life? Wow. If you haven't seen it in a while, though, I'd encourage you to watch it like at one sitting. I was talking with Andy yesterday, and it's like they just watched it. I watched it on the plane as we were heading to Israel from beginning to end, and it just it creates this whole picture, doesn't it? Where it's really a story. It's in the beginning of it of despair, and yet also a story of hope. And I think we can relate to all of that because Advent tells that same story. So the film's a vehicle, and we're just going to use that to speak into our Advent for starting today and for the next 3 Sundays as well. As we experience the good news that the hope of Christ overcomes the despair of the world. And as we wait, Advent's about not just preparation, but waiting in these in-between times, for Jesus in these different seasons of life, but especially this year, right? Yeah, the to-do list. We all have our Christmas to-do lists, or if you don't, it's in your head, or however you got it, but we feel like there's a lot on our plate. How do we find meaning in this when we're living through what we might consider the daily grind, right? For George, he had a lot of hopes and dreams. George Bailey. And none of them really turn out. They just don't. And if you don't know the story, of course, he comes to this place where he's just in such despair, he wants to end his life. And then we have this wonderful angel that comes to him named Clarence. And based on these are all spoiler alerts, by the way, based on something that George says, when he says, I wish I'd never been born, he gets this idea, and he makes it so George was never born. He sees the world, he sees the world, his world, what it would have been like had he never been born. And Clarence keeps telling him, you have a great gift here, George. You have a great gift. And George is going crazy. He thinks he's going crazy. And yet he realizes that so many lives were impacted because he stayed at the old building and loan. And that's how, as the movie comes to that end, he sees this wonderful gift and realizes he has done everything that he should have done. His life turned out to be so much more meaningful than if his dreams had come true, actually. That's a common theme throughout the Bible? I started thinking about how many people in the Bible ultimately didn't live out their dreams, or life took a turn that was unexpected. It starts right from the beginning. You get Adam and Eve in this beautiful garden, and then they get kicked out. They weren't expecting that. Now, that was on them. Sometimes the changes in our life are because of bad decisions or sin or whatever that we make, right? It's of our own doing. But certainly life did not turn out the way they had expected when they were first created in the garden. And then I went, and his Job. He lost his livestock, he lost his children, he lost his health. None of that is what he expected. Abraham and Sarah praying for children, and it wasn't happening. And now they were beyond the age of childbearing until God intervenes. Joseph, man, I love the story, the Old Testament story of Joseph. Talk about living a life that was unexpected. He's like daddy's number one. There's 12 of them, 12 kids, 12 sons. And here's Joseph, and his brothers get so mad at him, they sell him into slavery. And that's not what he was, that life wasn't turning out the way he expected. And then for doing the right thing, serving Potiphar, you know what? He gets thrown in jail for doing the right thing. And now he's in jail, and he asks somebody to go speak to Pharaoh on his behalf, and it takes them 2 years of waiting before this guy remembers Joseph. Right? Talk about, man, a reason to become bitter and in despair, right? Moses runs for his life. He should have been killed as a baby. That was the order, but no, he was saved, and he's now growing up in Pharaoh's house, but he ends up having to run for his life for committing a murder, and then he's got to deal with all of those stubborn people. I can relate, just no. And at the end of all of that, guess what? God says, time to go into the promised land, but Moses, you can't go. And it's not just, it's like, I'm going to tease, what a tease. It's like, Moses, I want you to look at it, but you can't go. You get to see it. Nope, can't go. Yeah. David sins and a child dies. Not what he planned. Solomon's 2 sons start a civil war against each other and divide the nation of Israel. Israel is eventually taken into Babylonian exile. Life's not turning out it's supposed to. You go to the New Testament, and now we get the New Testament Joseph, Mary and Joseph. Trust me, life wasn't turning out the way he expected when he finds out Mary's pregnant. And he's not the dad. Even Jesus, and I know he knew ahead of time, but on a purely human level, you listen to the prayer he prays in Gethsemane the night before, that night that he gets arrested, and it's, God, please let this happen differently. The disciples, this is when Lazarus dies, and they're going to go to Bethany. And this is Thomas. It says in John 11:16, and then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, well, let us go also, that we may die with him. And I'm sure they weren't thinking that when they started following Jesus 3 years before that. And in fact, all of the disciples, at least according to tradition, died a martyr's death, except for John, who died in exile on an island. And there's Paul, arrested, beaten. He's got what we believe is some physical ailment that he prays to God to take away, and God says no. See, sometimes, maybe a lot of times, life doesn't turn out the way you wanted it, the way you expected it, the way you planned it. Certainly true for George Bailey, but that's a movie. That's fiction. But as I look around our church, there's a certain luxury of having been here 25 years. I've seen a lot of your lives. You've seen mine. And what I see is not fiction. It's all too real. Divorce, where you got married and you didn't plan for that. Or you're a widow or a widower and you went through some really hard times even in the midst of that. Children not turning out the way you'd hoped. Losing jobs and wondering how you're going to support your family, or you're in a job you hate. And then there's illness, Craig alluded to that earlier. Cancer, heart attacks, strokes. And we've all had to deal with death in our lives. So we're going to start Advent in a way we've never done before. I want us to start Advent by positioning ourselves in a way maybe we don't think about or want to think about too much. And that is looking at the sovereignty of God. It's not a comfortable place. It's not a place that we like. It may not be a place we want, but it is the absolute best place that we could be. And actually, it is the place we're in anyway, whether we like it or not, whether we want it or not. It's a humbling place. So let me just describe it the way the Bible describes it for us. And you can go, I hate that. It's okay. The Bible often describes our relationship with God like a potter making a pot, or clay, the potter and the clay. Okay? By the way, God's the potter, just in case you have any doubt. And you and I are the clay. In Jeremiah it says, this is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, go down to the potter's house and I will give you my message. So I went down to the potter's house and I saw him working at the wheel. But the pot he was shaping from the clay was marred in his hands. So the potter formed it into another pot, shaping it as seemed best to him. You ever feel marred? Broken pots? And then the word of the Lord came to me, and he said, can I not do with you, Israel, as the potter does, declares the Lord? Like clay in the hand of the potter, so are you in my hand, Israel. If at any time I announce that a nation or kingdom is to be uprooted, torn down and destroyed, and if that nation I warn repents of its evil, then I will relent and not inflict it in disaster as I planned. And if at another time I announce that a nation or kingdom is to be built up and planted, and if it does evil in my sight and does not obey me, then I will reconsider the good I had intended to do for it. In other words, I'm going to do whatever I want. I get to make and shape the clay. So Paul talks about it this way in Romans. One of you will say to me, then why does God still blame us? Or for who is able to resist his will? But who are you, a human being, to talk back to God? Shall what is formed say to the one who formed it, why did you make me like this? Does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump of clay some pottery for special purposes and some for common use? And Isaiah says, you turn things upside down as if the potter were thought to be like the clay. Shall what is formed say to the one who formed it, you did not make me? Can the pot say to the potter, you know nothing? See, all those stories put us in the position of just saying, God is the sovereign God. He gets to do whatever he wants. But the good news is he's a loving God, so you can trust him in that. And if the stories just end in misery or loss, then we'd have every right to be depressed. But for God's people, that's never the end. So Job, once the hard lesson of God's sovereignty is learned, everything is restored to him twofold. Abraham and Sarah in their old age give birth to Isaac, in establishing God's chosen people. It begins. Joseph becomes Pharaoh's number one and saves his family and thereby the 12 tribes of Israel. Moses, right? God shows him the promised land and he dies, never getting to cross over. And somehow we think that after all he went through with the Israelites, that's just not fair. A couple of things. Fear is not a part of the equation in God's sovereignty. Okay? Fear is asking, but what about my rights? What rights do you really think you have before God? Secondly, Joshua could never have led in the promised land if Moses was still there. It was his time to lead. But perhaps the biggest piece we don't consider, Moses didn't get to go into that promised land. He immediately got to go into the promised land. Do you think he's complaining about that? No, I don't think so. And in the Christmas story, it wasn't Joseph's plan to be sure, but to be called to something much greater. Ultimately, what an honor. And the disciples, every one of them were willing to suffer for the sake of knowing Christ. For George Barely, nothing went as he dreamed or planned, but everything went according to God's plan. He has shown that if he wasn't born and lived the life, not of his choosing, but of his calling, a lot of other people would have been worse off for it. The world was better because George didn't live the dream life, but rather chose to live a humble life serving others. I don't know why we have to go through some of the things we go through. I do know this. We serve a sovereign God who has it all under control. Believe it. And he calls us to be faithful to him, whatever the circumstances, whatever the trial, whatever the difficulty, whatever the pain we sometimes find ourselves in. Remember that what is waiting for us is much more than we could ever imagine. And I'm going to talk about that next week. But for now, we endure some things in this life. Knowing God's promise means it won't last forever. Be faithful. Position yourself this Advent season before a sovereign God who loves you more than you know. And even when we don't understand everything, we are called to in this life. Let's respond like Mary, who has questions to the angel, by the way, about how and this is going to happen. But her ultimate response was this: even though she didn't quite understand it all, let it be to me according to your word. May that be our response as well. Lord, thank you for your sovereignty, that you are a God who is in charge and in control, because so often, as much as we want to be, God, in truth, we are not. And so we get to trust in one who is, for whom takes care of us, for whom we can trust completely. And for that, we give you thanks this morning.